welcome. Such a huge crowd tonight. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for coming. We are going to spend the next, we were scheduled to spend about an hour on this. And I'll be honest with you, it's hard to compress Lyme disease into an hour, okay? And so what I'm hoping to do is just to get through this. If I go over a little bit, apologize. If you need to leave, go ahead and go. But I'm going to go ahead and we'll get started here. And again, there's a lot of slides. And what I'll do is, if you have questions, if you can just write them down, and then at the end, I can stay. All right. But for now, try to hold them, okay, during the seminar. Does that make sense? Awesome. Okay, so we are going to talk here about Lyme disease, and really what I want to say here is we need to treat the person and not the diagnosis. Yeah, Lyme disease is, it's very hard to diagnose, and we'll get into that more in a minute here, but the testing, even the best tests out there, aren't foolproof. In other words, we find that some of the best tests out there have maybe a 70% chance of finding this very elusive disease, okay, caused by a type of bacteria. We'll talk about that in a minute, but it can be hard to track down using conventional testing. And so we're going to talk about some of the things that we do to try to help find it, figure it out, and then how you might treat it, okay? So it's hard to figure it out, and therefore the diagnosis it's really a clinical diagnosis. Clinical diagnosis means that it comes from gathering all the information you can, and not so often just relying on a blood test. Whereas so many other diseases, you can get a blood result and go, aha, we've got a diagnosis. With Lyme disease, it's not that cut and dried all the time. So let's jump in here and see if we can figure this out, but we've got to treat the person. And everybody here, and everybody that's out on the whole planet who has Lyme disease is going to be different and unique. We cannot use a cookbook approach or a cookie cutter approach. It just doesn't work. Even the protocols that are listed out there as the way to treat people, we found over the years, they just don't work for all people, okay? So what is Lyme disease? Well, it is caused by a bacteria called Borrelia, okay? Borrelia burgdorferi is the scientific name for it. It's the most common species of what I call the spirochete bacteria in the U.S. And this is one of the fastest growing infectious diseases in the United States. Now this is interesting because, as you'll see in a little bit, much of the medical community doesn't even recognize it. Matter of fact, they treat it, much of the medical community treats it as if it doesn't even exist. Lyme is a tick-borne illness that can carry with it several different co-infections. And that's what makes it even more elusive, is because it can carry other types of bacteria, it can carry viruses, it can carry parasites, and other things. And because of the three different phases that this critter is able to convert into, the different life stages of it, that's another reason it can be really hard to find and diagnose. So let's just take a quick look at these three phases here. So we've got a picture here, but really what we have is the Borrelia has this ability to shed its cell wall, and then it can shift into what's called a cyst formation. Well, if your immune system has targeted the cell wall, and then all of a sudden it shifts into, it confuses the immune system. That's part of the problem. And then it can also move then into what's called a spirochete, and it looks really much like a corkscrew, and it has the ability to corkscrew between cells and get deeper into the tissues. And that's another reason that it can become so elusive, because it can kind of get deep into tissues where the immune system can have a little bit harder time targeting it and finding it. And there's no tissue in the body that that Lyme disease, the Borrelia, can get into. And what really gets scary is when it gets into the neurologic tissue, into the brain tissue. Okay, as you'll see, it can mimic all kinds of really crazy neurologic conditions for which they have no cure for, like MS and Lou Gehrig's disease. Okay. It also has the ability to form something called a biofilm. Right? Have you heard of a biofilm before? All right. So a biofilm, you think of it as a sticky coating, and I have kids. I have 4 kids. Right? And they're under 10, and kids get these really icky boogers. Right? This is just being real with you. it's not the hard kind, it's not the real runny kind, it's like that in between, like that glue that you had in elementary school, you know, that Elmer's, not Elmer's, but that kind of clear glue, and it would just, it's sticky for a while, but it can become rock hard as well. And once it gets to be about 4 millimeters thick, it's impenetrable by your immune system. So these biofilms get formed, and Borrelia or other types of bacteria and co-infections aren't the only critters that can do this. Parasites can do this as well. So in people who have more advanced stages, or where they've had some kind of an infection for a long time, what can happen is the biofilm gets so thick that the immune system cannot get through, and these critters hang out in the biofilm, and they reproduce. And they do something also called, I don't have a slide on this, but called quorum sensing. Have you heard of quorum sensing before? Q-U-A-R-M, quorum, okay? And they communicate, well, cellular communication is done through frequency, vibration. And so one critter can actually communicate with other critters, and they have this ability then to change the way their DNA works. Well, you start changing DNA, now your immune system has an even harder time figuring out what it is. So one of the things that has to happen is that if you have advanced cases of some of these types of infections, you've got to be able to bust that biofilm so that you can get at these things, right? And antibiotics do not work to break up biofilms. So we'll talk more about this, but people who have chronic Lyme disease, this is where antibiotics fail. I think largely because biofilms are there and there's co-infections. Okay, so let's just take a look at some of the stats on Lyme disease. And this picture that I'm going to show you here goes back to 2011 here. And this is reported cases of Lyme disease in the U.S. And you know, one dot placed randomly in an area where there's one person confirmed in a county. And you can see that the upper East Coast area, and it all started in a town called Lyme, Connecticut, all right? And that's why I got its name, Lyme disease. And it kind of wants to stay in the upper parts of the U.S., it seems like. This map does not do it justice, though, because when you start to read the literature, and you start to read anecdotal evidence, you start to read practitioners all over the country, they're seeing influx of Lyme disease all over the place. In Northern California, it's gangbusters, but again, not confirmed diagnosis, so they can't put it on the list or on the map. But the epicenter was an area called Lyme, Connecticut, and I'm not a conspiracy theory guy, okay? But if you start to look into this, you'll find some really interesting information about why some people think Lyme disease got its start, and it has to do with government testing, all right? Look it up, it's really interesting. Ticks are a really good vector, a really good critter to carry these kinds of things. They're very hardy. They're hard to kill. If you've ever had a tick, you know that you can't just squish them. I mean, you've got to burn them, you've got to drown them, you've got to do things to kill them. Okay, so in the darker color here, these are confirmed cases, and then these are the years. 2008, 2009, we saw an influx there. And then probable cases, of course, are going to be more. I think that this is, and we're talking about in the 35 to 40,000, per year. I think most people who really work with Lyme patients are finding that it's much higher than that. I'll say this as well, that 2 summers ago, myself, my wife, and my now 9-year-old all had Lyme disease, acute Lyme disease. My 2 other kids at the time did not. We were all camping. We were all up in northern Wisconsin, and frankly, you don't even have to leave your backyard. Okay, you can be rolling around in the grass in the backyard, and all of a sudden you'll see a tick on your body, or other types of. Now we know other types of agents can carry, not just ticks. Okay, there's some that believe that you can get from mosquitoes, from fleas, and from other insects. So. It's a little bit scary. It's a little bit nerve-wracking to think that we're out there and there's these all these different types of insects. So don't just be vigilant with ticks, but with anything that's out there. So Lyme disease is transferred to humans by ticks, but again, some research is seeing Lyme in fleas, mosquitoes, and horse flies. And again, Borrelia is the species of bacteria that causes Lyme disease. And we'll talk about Bartonella and another one here in just a minute. So ticks carry it. It is found, Borrelia, the spirochete Borrelia is found in your tears, and it can be found in semen and vaginal fluid and in saliva. So it can be transferred just like syphilis, and actually syphilis is also a spirochete, same kind of form. Syphilis seems to be more easily treated than Borrelia. And this can be transferred from mom to baby in utero. So kids can be born with this. So again, it's just being vigilant, looking for signs and symptoms. Here's just a picture of some of the different types of, these are all ticks, and you can see the different sizes. The smallest here is going to be the larva stage, and you can have the larva on you, and it can be carrying Lyme. And you can't see these, they're so tiny. They get between your toes, they get to moist places. Really, they can be anywhere on the body. And then they get to the nymph stage, adult and male and female. And this is a picture of an engorged dog tick. So this dog tick just basically is full of blood, and it's pretty gross, right? Well, these same things want to do that to you. They'll burrow in. They are looking for a meal. They're looking for a meal from you. And when they get their meal from you, they're also transmitting what they happen to be carrying. Whatever they're carrying, it's in your blood. And what we see is that the risk of human infection is greatest in the late spring and in the summer. So this is why we're having this seminar right now. We want people to be prepared, okay? Because springtime is the time that we see this. You're out walking, and you're in the tall grass or you're in the short grass, and you need to be checking yourself. So the eggs are laid in the spring, the larva stage in the summer, and then by the next spring they're a nymph stage, and then they get bigger and bigger until the cycle continues. Okay. So Lyme disease can carry with it many co-infections, as I mentioned. Some of the common ones that we'll see include something called ehrlichiosis, and then we see Bartonella, which is also called cat scratch fever. You've heard of that before? No? Okay. Well, it comes from a cat. Okay. Cats and dogs are highly susceptible to being, being outside, getting a tick. Okay. They scratch you, even whether they're not being mean, they just happen to scratch you, and they can transfer very easily. Babesia is similar to malaria, and then we can go right on through, but some of the other ones you might recognize. There's one called chlamydia. We'll talk more about that in a minute. There's chlamydia, which is a sexually transmitted disease, but there's also chlamydia pneumoniae, so often linked to pneumonia. So there's lots of other ones that can carry, including Epstein-Barr, which causes mono, right? So mono, people get that all the time. How do they feel? Tired, lethargic. They have no energy. Well, those are common symptoms of Lyme disease as well. So some of the acute symptoms include this flu-like symptoms. This is one of the biggest, and this is what my wife had, and this is what made me suspicious. My wife, who's never sick, because we take good care of ourselves, had flu symptoms in the early summer, in June. I thought, yeah, this just seems odd to me. She started to develop joint pain. Then my 10-year-old started to develop left knee pain, just left knee pain. No injury behind it. I had no symptoms at all. But my wife also started to notice that she couldn't think clearly. This is a hallmark of neurologic Lyme, is that they get brain fog. You can't think clearly. You can't concentrate. You can't focus. Your mental clarity is just not there. So we went to a colleague of mine who practices applied kinesiology, which is a form of muscle testing that we can use to get information about what's happening in the body without expensive lab work. And he used an energetic vial, a vial that contained the energy of different type of critters. You just have to go with me on this a little bit. And sure enough, 3 of us out of the 5 that were tested had it. And at that point, we were in we figured about 6 weeks from exposure. And the authorities that I've read and study with say that 6 weeks is kind of the window, that if you go much longer than that, it gets a lot harder to take care of with antibiotics. So what did we have to do? We had to do 6 weeks of double antibiotics, my wife and I, and my son had to as well. And I'll say this, we found a medical doctor who literally prescribed the things over the phone, sight unseen, because she believes how bad this can be if you let it go. There aren't many doctors who will do that. And at the same time, seeing my colleague, we were also taking natural supplements, whole food nutritional supplements to boost our immune system. And thankfully, I think that we were able to take care of it. We haven't had any of those same symptoms since, but I'm always on the lookout because chronic Lymes will do this. It'll hide, people will feel good for a period of time, and then later on in life, they just start to go downhill. Okay? So, acute symptoms, if you even think that you might have acute Lyme, you need to find a medical doctor who will actually prescribe you antibiotics. This is a time and a place that I believe that this is important, okay? Now, a bullseye rash is what we call pathognomonic. That means that you don't have to have a test. If you see a bullseye type of rash, literally it's red, looks like a bullseye, and you've been out in the woods or you have been out in the yard, and boom, they're going to say that's Lyme. And they're going to treat you with powerful antibiotics. Now, this rash only happens in 20 to 50% of the time. None of us had it. Other friends of mine who've also had acute Lyme disease, none of them have had the red rash. The patients that I've seen come in here, out of all the patients that I've seen, which is quite a few who have Lyme, only one has actually had the rash. So you can't rely on that. Unfortunately, the medical doctors do. If you tell them you don't have a rash, then they just don't even go there. So many don't. Chronic symptoms. Okay, these are where it gets really kind of serious because people get misdiagnosed for years. They include the acute symptoms, brain fog, flu symptoms, things like that. But it can mimic, Lyme disease can actually mimic all these other diseases, including MS, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, Lou Gehrig's disease. These are neurologic diseases, rheumatoid arthritis. I mean, how many of us know people who have RA, rheumatoid arthritis? We see them all the time. Lupus. So these, in many cases, they're called autoimmune diseases. And it's true, the immune system is attacking your own tissues. But I think in part, because it's trying to attack these critters. Okay? Degenerative joint disease. This is another thing that we'll see. A person comes in, they don't have an injury, and they have one joint that hurts. It's just this odd joint. And they go, well, it's just my old trick football knee, all right? But it's swollen like a balloon for no reason. It's infection, okay? So these are some of the things that we need to think about here, and I'll ask patients. Difficulty sleeping, okay? Falling asleep, staying asleep. Migratory pain. This is somebody who talks about having pain on one side of the body and then the next week it's on the other side of the body. Chronic fatigue or fibromyalgia. By the way, chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia are probably the two most common diagnoses given to people who really have Lyme disease. And they'll go 15, 20 years misdiagnosed. Because those terms, frankly, are catch-all terms that are used when we don't know what it is. There's not a test that says conclusively you have fibromyalgia. But if you've got pain that's all over your body or migraines, boom, that's what they give you, fibromyalgia. Neurologic disturbances, this has to do with things like brain fog, short-term memory issues. You walk into a room and forget why you walked in there. You leave Walmart, you forget where you parked your car, okay? Allergies, endocrine dysfunction, this is hormone fluctuations and imbalances. Gastrointestinal disorders. So, these look like a lot of other things, don't they? I mean, these look like a lot of other disease processes. That's why it can be so hard to figure this out. So, people that are going to see this, and some of you that are in here have had some of these symptoms, or people who have, and they've been tested for Lyme disease and the results were negative. This is the other thing that's just so sad about this, is that the typical screening test for Lyme disease, the accuracy is abysmal. I've I don't know how many countless people who've come in and they say, yeah, doc, I had Lyme tested. I had the Lyme screen and it came back negative. And then we run a test called IGeneX from California, and sure enough, it comes back and it was positive. So what they got was a false negative. They truly were carrying the disease, but the test didn't check enough parameters. Okay. So conventional testing is going to start with something called an ELISA test, which misses 2/3 of the cases. Well, if you're a doctor who doesn't even believe necessarily in Lyme disease, or think that it's a real entity, and the test comes back negative 2/3 of the time, what are you going to do? You got to come up with an idea for somebody. You got to tell them it's something. So what I hear is, well, I think it's in your head. I'm not joking. And the people come in and they're on Wellbutrin, and they're on Celexa, and they're on other types of antidepressants because it must be in your head. And that's scary. And that's scary. So if ELISA comes back positive, then the Western blot test is used to confirm it, and this one has only a 44.6% sensitivity, less than 50% accuracy. So if that's the best we have, then we're in trouble unless we have another method, right, to try to figure this out. So Lyme disease goes undiagnosed, missed over and over and over. So what do we do different? Well, we do lab testing. We also do kinesiology testing, which is a fancy word for saying using a muscle or a muscle reflex to find out if an organ is not working good, or to find out if there may be an infection in the body. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the different types of lab testing that we might do with a person. There's no cookie cutter approach, as I said. But here's a little bit about some of the things that we would order if we think that it's Lyme disease. We're going to order something called a CD57, complement C3A and C4A. These may mean nothing to you, and I don't honestly have time to go into all these, but these can help us diagnose it. We'll look at 25-OH vitamin D. You've heard of vitamin D3 before. We also look at 125-OH vitamin D. These, if those markers for vitamin D are down in the really low range, like below 30, that gets my head thinking, okay, we may be dealing with Lyme disease here, or some kind of a nasty immune problem. And lately, I've seen a few people come in who their vitamin D3 levels were down in the 15. Well, that's really low. This person is in trouble. And go on and on. My favorite test is actually IGeneX, and because they do something called PCR and a very detailed Western blot test. The problem with it is the test is about $600. These tests aren't cheap, and insurance won't cover them. Okay? But guess what? Your health is your investment, so at some point, sometimes you have to bite the bullet. So how about some other trends that I'll see just on your regular metabolic panel, okay? So we can run a blood test, just the type of blood test you might get from your medical doctor, but if we see high or low white blood cells, that usually means infection. Then if we start to look at lymphocytes and neutrophils, we can start to narrow it down. Are we thinking it's bacteria? Are we thinking it's viral? What might it be? Remember, Borrelia can carry viruses, it can carry bacteria, it can carry parasites, all these different types of things. If a person has high fasting glucose and A1C, most doctors are going to say, well, you've got insulin resistance or diabetes. Well, those numbers can be up due to an infection, and so on. If we see elevated thyroid antibodies and somebody has something called Hashimoto's disease, that's another thing that we think about that could be related to Lyme disease, because the body's attacking your own tissue. It's autoimmune disease, and so on. More things that we can look at. MTHFR gene, have you heard of this before? Okay, methylene tetrahydrofolate, big fancy long word. Reductase. This is really getting a lot of press lately. Not mainstream, but in the communities that deal with neurologic issues. especially with autism. This is a gene, and what we're finding is that there's a defect on a particular part of this gene, which means that a person can't do what's called methylation. I'm going to go into that in a little bit, but that test can be really important. If we happen to run that test and we find that there's a genetic aberration there, then we start thinking maybe there's an infection here, okay? Because the person cannot, they can't methylate their DNA. Bad deal. We'll talk more about that. And I'm not going to go through every one of these, but there's a lot of tests that we can use, okay, to help try to find this thing. Borrelia has the ability to express lipoproteins, okay? These are lipid proteins on the outer membrane of their cell wall, and these things are they're pro-inflammatory, which means that whenever we have inflammation, a type of white blood cell we have called a neutrophil will get attracted to that area. Remember, our immune system's job is to kill stuff. It's just to wipe out things that are supposed to be there for it. So this would be a natural response. And then you get these things called cytokines, and these are called inflammatory proteins. And what happens is that we get transformation of B cells 50 to 500 times more than other lipoproteins on other bacteria. So the Borrelia, just to bring this down into a quick synopsis, is that it causes an immune reaction that is magnified by 500 times of what you might find in just your typical bacteria. So your body is under an all-out assault, and the immune system is just jacked up. When the immune system gets that jacked up, those cytokines and other inflammatory markers can cross the blood-brain barrier, which is one of the reasons people get this brain fog. And if you have ever seen the movie, it's a documentary called Under Our Skin. Have you heard of that? You should watch that. Under Our Skin, or Under My Skin. And it chronicles several people who have chronic Lyme disease and what they go through. And it's really sad to see, especially one of the women on there who has a really severe neurologic Lyme. And I guess what I'm not here to try to scare you guys. Ultimately, I'm here to tell you that there's hope. There really is hope. That a person can have way more good days than bad days with this issue, as long as we can find out what's driving it. Okay? What's driving it. Also, we can have what's called molecular mimicry, where specific antibodies that your body releases can start to attack something called flagellin. Well, flagellin, have you heard of flagella before? Okay, different types of bacteria have these. They're like these tentacles to help them to swim and move around. Well, flagellin is a protein, and what happens is your body will send antibodies that target it. Well, unfortunately, you can get a cross reaction where your immune system starts to target myelin, which is the covering of your nerves. Molecular mimicry says that some things look like other things, and the immune system doesn't see the difference, and this is where people can get symptoms of MS. Well, MS is multiple sclerosis, right? And that's a neurologic disease, and what do they have for that? They have drugs. Well, if you have an active infection, a drug is not going to take care of that. You've got to kill that thing. Don't you agree? Would that make sense? You'd want to try to target that critter and kill it and boost your immune system. So it is absolutely possible for people with MS to have their symptoms completely reduced because they truly have Lyme disease. Okay, so here it again. I just said this. So we get this inflammatory cascade. Free radicals are produced, oxidative damage, and so on. We can produce neurotoxins. Again, neurotoxins means that it's toxic to the nervous system. Okay? It damages the nerve cells, which is what was happening with MS. There's research that shows that people who have died of Lou Gehrig's disease, okay, you've heard of that, ALS? You know that's a really nasty, slow, progressive way to go. Well, they've found actual the Borrelia and other coinfections in the brains of people who died of ALS. So I'm not saying that's the cause in every case, but I think it's interesting, something to look at. And then autoimmunity may result, where your body makes antibodies that start to attack your own tissue. Are you guys with me so far? Am I going too fast? Okay, good. Lyme also has the ability to release these things called blebs, which are partial DNA. The test, IGeneX test that I run, actually can look at these plasmids. It'll look and find out if DNA plasmids are found. That's why I think it's such a good test, because it looks a lot deeper. Okay, it's not just so surfacey. But these blebs cause the immune system to react, and then they start to convert your own cells into immune targets, almost like a cancer cell. Your immune system will want to target it. And so people will start to get these other positive tests. Rheumatoid factor. So a person will show up with an RA factor on a blood test, and the doctor will say, wow, you've got rheumatoid arthritis, or you've got some other autoimmune disease. And then that's one of the ways that a person ends up on this downward spiral, because if you're diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis, when you have an active infection, the treatment protocols are going to be completely different, right? Okay, so that's just a little background on some of the lab testing that's important. And then the second component that we use here is going to be kinesiology testing, all right? So here's how it works. I should have brought these in here, but imagine a little tiny vial with some liquid in it. And don't ask me how, but they have been able to take an energetic imprint, the frequency of Borrelia, Babesia, Bartonella, you name it. Here's how. Here's why, I should say. Everything has a vibratory frequency. This table has molecules that are vibrating. A nutritional supplement, a critter, anything you can think of. Us, all our cells have their very specific, just like a thumbprint, vibratory frequency. My thumbprint is unique to me, just like yours is to you, and nobody has the same thumbprint. The Borrelia burgdorferi, for example, has a very specific energetic frequency that can be measured with fancy equipment. So they've been able to actually measure the vibratory frequency of, you name the substance, literally hundreds of thousands of things. And then they can imprint it and put it in a liquid vial. So the vial itself doesn't carry the critter. It doesn't carry Borrelia, but it carries the energetic frequency. Now, if a person were to hold that vial close to their body, the frequency that's in that vial of Borrelia is now interacting via quantum physics, via frequency interaction with the cells in my body. And a person's body will go weak. The muscle test, kinesiologic testing, will cause that muscle to be weak. That's just a high-level overview of what that looks like. But the beauty behind it is not only can we find out if a person is reacting to that frequency, but then we can find out what kind of nutritional supplement or antibacterial herb might work to kill it. Okay? So I want to take a couple minutes and then talk about the different co-infections that go along with Lyme disease. Bartonella, and here are some of the symptoms that people will talk about. They'll feel cold all the time. Cold hands and feet. That's a big one. Sharp pains on the soles of the feet. They get these sharp shooting knife-like headaches. I have a woman right now who's in her 70s, and she gets these migraines right here. And they've called it, the doctors over the years have called it an indomethacin headache. Well, I checked her recently, and sure enough, she tested weak, muscle testing, to Borrelia. So I think she's been getting these knife-like headaches all these years because she's had an infection, not because she lacks a drug called Imitrex. Okay? That's what they gave her. Hot flashes and joint pain, swollen lymph nodes, gastritis, high liver enzymes, and so on. Sleep problems. That's Bartonella. And I can get these lists to you too some other time if you don't have time to write all these down, okay? Bartonella can develop into the following. I'm not going to read all these here. Cat scratch fever we mentioned. Chronic fatigue syndrome. This is probably the biggest that we see. These are people that just don't have energy to get through their day. Okay? Endocarditis, because it can cause inflammation around the heart valves. And so on. Bacteria in the blood. Eye inflammation, that's another one that we see. I have a gentleman right now, he's an occupational therapist, huge guy, 6 foot, he's about 6'3", big dude, and his issues, chronic fatigue, eye inflammation, those were his two main things, and then he gets this kind of burning on the bottoms of his feet, and sure enough, I check him with the imprint of that vial, Bartonella showed up. Bartonella. Babesia, this is another co-infection. Common fatigue and night sweats. Again, joint pain, fever, chills, weakness, weight loss. They get iron deficiency anemia, and so on. You have a headache, shortness of breath. A lot of times what I'll see is somebody who has this, what we call air hunger. They'll say things like, "Doc, I can't describe it, but I feel like I want to breathe deeper and I can't. Like I want more air. I'm hungry for more air and I just can't get it." Air hunger. So, babesia. Ehrlichiosis, okay, fever, chills, myalgia, that's muscle pain. Confusion, very red eyes, nausea, vomiting. Mycoplasma. I'm not going to go through every one of these, but mycoplasma has been linked to Gulf War syndrome. So these GIs are coming back, and they, after the Gulf War, and they have these chronic pains, headaches, GI problems, they can't sleep, they're losing their hair, and they chalked it up in many cases to the different chemical reactions that they were around over there. Some now believe it could be due to bites that they got from some critter. Chlamydia pneumoniae, okay, this is that chronic cough. People will have that walking pneumonia, headaches, bronchitis, laryngitis, sinusitis. Oh my goodness, how many people do you know have chronic sinus infections? All right? Chronic infections, sinuses. They've been treated with antibiotics over and over and over. They've gone natural routes, but it hasn't quite taken care of it. What if there's an infection? Okay? Guillain-Barré syndrome. Guillain-Barré is literally paralyzed, can't even speak, and it hurts, and yet you're awake. It's like being trapped, just trapped completely in the body. So it's very interesting. So let's talk a little bit about the difference between acute Lyme then and chronic Lyme disease. We've gone through a little bit of this already. More flu-like symptoms, responds well to antibiotics. Good. That's great. Chronic does not respond well to antibiotic and is usually seen as learned diseases like we talked about. And unfortunately, chronic Lymes can be lifelong because I think in some cases it's been there so long, it's just, no matter what a person does, they're not going to get rid of it completely. Okay? But it's possible to have way more good days than bad days. Other cases, just completely misdiagnosed, and they just go to their grave that way. Patients with chronic Lymes can have the following. So these ones you might want to really note. Pain that comes and goes and migrates. They talk about having joint pain, okay, arthritis. They talk about having myalgia, that's fibromyalgia, that's muscle pain. Or they'll have nerve type pain. Pain is influenced by hormones. So a woman, for example, may have her cycle and notice that she gets increased symptoms during the cycle. And they can actually have what's called a Herxheimer reaction. Okay, have you heard of that before? Well, it was a guy who came up with the name, and it's a reaction where the toxins released from these different types of bacteria and parasites, when they die, the toxins circulate through the system and they cause all kinds of interesting symptoms. Now, when we are actually working with somebody who has Lyme disease and we are giving them some kind of a nutritional supplement or herbs or homeopathics that work to kill these critters, when we get what's called a Herx reaction, we often we're happy. That means that things are dying, even though the person may not feel that good. Usually, though, it'll last a couple days, and then they can start to get better again. But when we see them associated with a women's cycle, then we need to be cognizant that that could be Lyme. Antibiotic use may increase or decrease the pain. Again, antibiotics, they kill things, and they might get a Herx reaction, so they might have increase in symptoms. Pain may be resistant to the standard treatments, like your medications, your SSRIs, like your antidepressants and things like that. And pain is associated with multiple systemic symptoms. So people have complaints in their GI system as well as in their neurology. They have complaints in their muscle system. These kinds of things aren't, if you're having symptoms in multiple different systems in your body, like your brain and then joints, that's not normal. You know what I mean? Usually with just typical infections, one system is going to be affected way more tn the others, like respiratory. But when we start to see multiple systems, that's a red flag, okay? So we talked a little bit about this earlier. Many chronic Lyme patients have this methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase gene. Okay, it's abnormal. And so methylation is the process of taking methyl groups to the cell to be used at the level of the DNA. Now, look, we have been brought up, I was brought up with the belief that our genes come from our parents, and that if your parents had heart disease, then there's a good chance you're going to have heart disease. If your mom had breast cancer, then there's a good chance that you might get breast cancer. Have we kind of heard that stuff? Okay, years and years and years on your history forms, they ask you, any parent's history of these, or grandparents. Well, and then they'll say you're at risk for these diseases. The Human Genome Project has shown that only about 3% of all the diseases that you can name are due to heredity. Things like Down syndrome, okay, where there's a true genetic defect like that. But the other 97% are due to our environment. What we put in our body, how we think, what's infections. Because what happens is that your genes can be turned on. So, a gene that might code for breast cancer, you may never get breast cancer. But if you eat a crappy diet, and you think badly, and you have chronic infections, and you don't have good methylation, well, the gene that codes for cancer can get turned on like a light switch gets turned on a lot easier. Does that make sense? This is why we talk about people taking care of their health, because the more things we do to take care of our health, the more likely we are to keep a gene turned off, right? So we want to make sure that we have good methylation, really good methylation of our DNA. And your stomach is the primary methyl donor. And this is where I harp on people about hydrochloric acid, HCl. If you're over 30, you need to take it with every meal, because people over 30 just don't make it as much as when they were kids. HCl will help to donate a methyl group so that your genes can get methylated and not get turned on, okay? But if you have this genetic defect, then you may need some additional help. And the methylation process is also dependent on vitamin B6, folic acid, vitamin B12. So these are all B vitamins we're talking about here. If you're not taking a good quality B vitamin, you might want to rethink that. This is called SAMe for short, and these are just other things that methylation process needs. And glutathione, this is a huge one. If you haven't heard of glutathione, this is critical for the whole this whole process. And many Lyme patients are in need of detoxification, and glutathione is an excellent way to open health with detoxification and reduce inflammation. Okay? So, how can you increase your glutathione? most people don't jump right into doing coffee enemas. But I'm here to tell you that it's a fantastic way because it works in the liver. The coffee enema actually stimulates your liver, and you can increase your glutathione levels with this. So, I know I'm flying kind of fast and furious here, and we'll stick around at the end if you have other questions. But right now, I just want to take a minute and discuss what's the medical approach and then some of the other ways. So the medical approach is typically this, and please hear my heart. I'm not trying to be judgmental. These are actual comments that I hear. Okay, this is what I hear from patients who come in. The medical doctors tell people or think that they are whacked. Not all, many. Now, there is a group of people around the country, medical doctors, that are considered Lyme literate. They actually have a process of becoming a Lyme literate doctor. You go through coursework to learn about what is this thing, what is Lyme disease, and what are the signs and symptoms, and how do you fix it. But many of the MDs think that people are just crazy, that it's just in their head, and that there's no such thing as chronic Lyme disease. And it gets really confusing. I mean, can you imagine if you were told, well, it's just in your head? Our testing has all come back negative. There's nothing wrong with you, and yet you go through your day and you're not living. Learn to live with it. So this is common. The other route for most medical doctors, not all, most, is going to be to give high doses of antibiotics. Well, as I said earlier, high-dose antibiotic doesn't work very well in chronic Lyme patients. How about an alternative approach? Alternative would mean things like nutritional supplements and or homeopathic remedies. Now, these can be awesome. These can work really well, and they are absolutely a part of the puzzle. But what I would say is that we need to do something where we're integrated, where we actually have a medical doctor on our side who not only believes and understands it, is willing to work with somebody who uses natural protocols, and also may want to use antibiotics, and may want to use other forms of care all together. To me, that makes the most sense. Why can't we, work together on this? Integrated approach. And so, what is the best approach for a patient? I think that it means that we come together and we work together for the best for the patient. So how do I know if a person has this? Well, we're going to do lab tests, we're going to use kinesiology testing, and we're going to use neurologic testing. What is neurologic testing? We're going to check the brain. We're going to check the nervous system. We're going to check the cerebellum. We don't need fancy MRIs to do that. We can do it with neurologic, functional neurology testing. And when we find that a brain is not firing the way it's supposed to, that's one piece of the puzzle that we have to work on. Okay? Okay. Now, along with Lyme disease, and this is where it gets I don't know, where you got to remember that it can be challenging, because people have other, what we call health breakers or deal breakers, right? A deal breaker means that no matter what your diagnosis or symptoms are, if the deal breaker is not managed, you're not going to get better from whatever you came in with. Does that make sense? Okay, we're going to talk about those in a second here. But what really happens with people who have chronic Lyme disease is that they have what's called a web of physiologic dysfunction. Lots of different things are not working correctly. You can't just give somebody an antibiotic and expect it to do the work if the liver's not working good. Okay? So here are some of the deal breakers. You might want to write these down. Okay? If a person has gut dysfunction, remember that 80% of your immune system is in the gut, in the small intestine. Leaky gut syndrome is one of the problems. If you have a blood sugar control problem, all right? If you're too high, that's called insulin resistance. If you're too low, that's called hypoglycemia. Either way, that is a deal breaker, because without adequate blood sugar control, that's the number one stressor on the body, and your brain needs that as a fuel source. Your brain needs two things: it needs fuel, and it needs stimulation. And fuel comes from blood sugar, glucose, and it comes from oxygen. The other things would be systemic inflammation. If you have autoimmune disease, where the immune system is attacking your own tissues. If you have brain or neurotransmitter dysfunction. If you have anemia. Remember, a second ago I said the brain needs two things. It needs fuel and stimulation. Anemia is about your body's ability to carry oxygen. So if you have anemia that's not addressed, it's going to be impossible, nearly impossible, to fix or help somebody who has chronic Lyme disease. And we go on. Liver, gallbladder, fatty acid metabolism, and so on. Now, a couple things I want to just highlight. We're not going to go into great detail here. EMFs, electromagnetic frequencies. These are from cell phones, from cell phone towers, from these kinds of things can interfere with your health. Dental work. Oh my goodness. We find people who have dental infections all the time using kinesiology, muscle testing, that was missed by the dentist because the dentist relies on an x-ray. And the teeth, every single tooth, is associated with multiple organs through an energetic pathway called a meridian. So if you have an underlying tooth infection, even without tooth symptoms, it can actually be interfering with the flow of energy to a certain organ. I'm going to give you a quick example. A woman back in January comes in, and she's got this heart arrhythmia, and she's got this buzz back behind her ear. All right? Now, she had gone to the University of Minnesota, and she'd gone to Mayo, and they said, well, you passed all the tests, we don't know what's going on here. So I did some muscle testing and found that in her upper left tooth quadrant, there was a problem. How did I know a problem? Because the muscle tested weak. Light pressure here. Now, I said, do you have any dental work there? She says, well, yeah, I had a root canal. And she also had a crown. And I said, well, you need to go back to your dentist and have them check it because I think there's an infection. So she goes back to her dentist, and the dentist looks and says, no, everything's fine. So he's just doing what he's trained, okay? And I'm not a dentist. I said, listen, I want you to go see a biological dentist. This is a dentist who has some advanced training in the connection between the teeth and the whole body. The biological dentist removed the cap, the crown, and I actually got the picture sent via email. I wish I had them here. It was black underneath that crown and on the top of the tooth, which is clearly infection. So she had to use fancy laser sterilization to take care of this infection in there. But as soon as the infection was taken care of in there, the buzzing cleared up and the heart arrhythmias went away. That tooth happened to be associated with the heart. So these are things we have to think about. Toxicity issues and food sensitivities too, okay? So all of these different things need to be functioning optimally for a person who has Lyme disease or anything else to get maximum healing. One more thing about lab testing, and this, what we see a lot of times is with lab testing, is that the lab ranges are very broad. Okay, when you go into the to get lab work done, this is a little bit of lab work that I would have done. I'm not going to go through all of it with you. Food testing, these are some of the different food testing that we might have done with people. Gluten reactivity is a really great test to run because most people nowadays are having a gluten reaction that don't even know it, or they're cross-reacting to other foods that look similar to gluten, corn, rice, and potato, and other grains, coffee, and so on. Organic acid tests sometimes we have to run. I'm just going to scoot through these pretty fast here. But I want to show you something here. We use what's called a functional lab range, and typically when you have a test done, let's pick TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone, the lab range is going to be between 0.45 and 4.5. And so if you're within that range, then the doctor says, well, you're fine. But the functional range, or the range at which you're healthy, is 1.8 to 3.0. And so what happens is if you're a little bit above 3.0 or a little below 1.8, you're still going to fall within their range, but within the functional or healthy range, you're not doing good. But it gets missed. The same is true of all these different labs. Glucose is another big one. It's common for people to show up with a glucose level around 75. They've been told that they're fine, when in fact it needs to be at least 85. Okay, so they have a deal breaker. Needs to be fixed. These are some of the points that we look at when we do kinesiology testing. The sleep point is right behind the ear. We can muscle test for that. The energy point is above the ear. Thyroid, of course, is right here. Stomach, and so on. If one of these points goes weak when we muscle test it, that is an indication to me that that organ needs help. So, how do we do things in the office here? Well, we use individually tailored natural protocols that is specific to each person, because there's no cookbook approach. And this is how we are going to help you, or whoever you're here to represent, to heal. And our goal really is to decrease the systemic inflammation, to detoxify that body, and increase the function of the immune system. And when we can do these three things, amazing things can happen in a person's life. So we want to have the pH in a good range. We'll talk more about this on another time. These are some of the keys. A healthy pH in the 6.4 to 7.0. How do you know what your pH is? Well, you get some pH strips and you take a first morning urine pH. You find out if you're acidic, you're below that range. If you are, well, that's a pretty good indication something's wrong. Detoxification. We may have to do some different types of detoxification with you. Oxygen therapy to get fuel to your brain. Neurologic testing and support, so we can fire up the cerebellum if it's not working the way it's supposed to. And then we only use the highest quality supplements, because these are what I take and this is what I give my family, and if this is good for me, then it's good for my patients. And the difference between with the kind of supplements we use is that we use whole food nutrition. There's nothing synthetic in it, all right? It's whole food. It came from actual food. And the reason it's important is because your body's going to react best to something that was completely natural, not synthetic, okay? So these are just some of the different supplements that we might use. And again, I'm not going to go through all these with you, just to save time. We talked about this, EMFs, emotions, EFTs, emotional issues. As important, or maybe more important than dental issues, are emotions and how emotions affect the body. Now, I don't know very many doctors who address this. And I'm here to tell you that if you or someone you love has some kind of illness and they have emotions that have not been dealt with, it's almost impossible to get 100% healthy. Now, there's science behind this. This isn't just something that's new age thinking, okay? Emotions affect physical health. Now, I'm just going to give you a quick example, just because of time here. This happened on Thursday, so this is really recent. A woman comes to me, now I haven't seen her for a while. She used to come in just for chiropractic care, and she came in and she had a really nasty neck and upper right shoulder pain, and she was getting headaches from it. And it came out of the blue. She didn't remember any sort of injury. And I know that in many cases of a person who has neck pain, something happened where they've had a sense of something of an injustice happen to them. Okay? Now, I've just seen this. I've worked with it many times, and I've read literature on this. Just go with me. I know it's going to sound strange. But I simply asked her, I said, did something happen recently that you felt a sense of injustice, or that some kind of morality was breached on your part? And she looks at me like I had two heads, and she says, well, yeah, my job. Now, what happened was she had a job where there was a lot of responsibility on her. It was a high level organization. administrative assistant, and what happened was they were treating her poorly, and there was no reason for it, and different people were ganging up on her, including her boss, and it came out of nowhere, and nobody ever had any justification for it, and she didn't start to experience symptoms until she literally quit that job and got a new job. And when all the stress was relieved, she started to experience pain there. And I know this is going to sound strange, but the reason she started to have pain there is because she actually was healing from the incident. But she didn't know all this. And how did we figure this out? We muscle tested her and literally found that her body went weak when she talked about having a sense of injustice happen to her. I didn't even have to adjust her. This is the thing that's kind of weird and really crazy, is I didn't even have to adjust her. That's what she came for, but she didn't need that. And she let me know that this was today, via email, that her pain went away that night. All we did was help her to come to grips with that she had an emotional thing. Now, would it have gone away? Well, maybe. I don't believe so. I think she had an emotional thing happen and she was releasing it. So these are really important, and if this is left untreated, a person is going to have a hard time healing. Okay, so the reason that we're doing this here, and we hoped, of course, that there would be a lot more people here, but to try to give people hope. To try to give people hope that there's a way to get through this, even though it may sound so horrible. If you read and hear about these people that have chronic Lyme disease, but to give people hope, to empower them, to help them know that they have some control in their life, and that there are options for actually beating these things and getting better, okay? And I really want to help people not to just survive, but to thrive. To thrive, you have to be willing to do some hard things. All right? Now, one of the questions I often get is, with the kind of care we do, well, doc, is insurance going to cover this? And I just want to come out and say that it doesn't. Insurance doesn't cover the kind of care we do, and you'll have to ask them why. But we are here to get people better, and people come here who've been everywhere else, who've told that there's nothing left that can be done. All right? So that's why we're here. And I've given you a ton of information. What you do with it is up to you, and up to the people that are watching this on video. But I will give you 110%. If a person decides to come in here, I'll give you all that I have to try to help a person get better. But one thing I've learned is that a person who is not at least 8 out of 10 committed, in other words, their level is below 8, committing to doing the kind of work that we do here, they're not going to get better. And that's just the way it is. And so I would say, don't start doing this kind of work until you're absolutely ready to commit. You may have to change your diet. You may have to eat some things that you're not used to eating. Right, Benny? You may have to take some herbs that don't taste so good. You may have to do some neurologic work. Okay, these are things that may have to be done. And information without action is not going to help anybody. So what I say is that if any of the stuff makes sense here, that we talked about makes sense to you, and you want to get checked further, well then, and you're not already a patient, like some of you are, well then set up an appointment for a consultation. We'll sit down. It costs nothing to just meet. Consultation is nothing. If we decide to move forward with an exam, then there's a fee, but because you've been here or because you watched this, we'll give you a great discount on that, and we'll just see if we can help you. See if we can find the answer, find out why, what's driving it. So I want to thank you then for being here tonight. I went over a few minutes, but I hope at least you have a better idea about what Lyme disease is and what it might take to take care of it. All right? Thanks for coming. And then I'll stick around, okay, and we'll answer some questions if you have questions.